Thanks to Amazon's new Fallout series, I've been getting back into the world of Fallout, and I've been working my way through the Fallout games again. I've always been fascinated by the world building that Bethesda have put into their Fallout games, and that extends to the vaults. Some of the vaults in Fallout were intriguing, some were horrifying, and some were just heartbreaking. In this video, we'll be looking at the vaults of Fallout 3 and the lore behind them. I've recently released the Story Explained video for the story of Fallout 3, and there's tons of sweet lore in that one, so if you haven't checked that out yet, I'd recommend you do that first. I'm going to get started on playing New Vegas and then Fallout 4 very soon, and I'll have separate videos on the vaults for those games too. I'm also going to be doing a lore and order video for each Fallout game, so keep an eye out for those ones. But that's enough of an introduction, let's dive straight in. So I covered this in the other video, but before the war and before the bombs fell in October 2077, Vault-Tec were awarded a contract by the government to build a load of bunkers, 122 vaults to be exact. But this project pretty much crippled the US government financially for a project that would only see 0.1 of the US population guaranteed a space. Originally named Project Safe House, these vaults would shelter citizens of the United States in the event of a nuclear holocaust, and the idea was that the US would stand a greater chance of repopulation if citizens' long-term survival was ensured. Most of the vaults were completed by 2063, although some construction projects in Washington DC got delayed, such as Vault 108, which suffered a work stoppage. Now, Vault-Tec developed many advanced technologies that allowed these vaults to function, and of course their primary function was to keep humanity alive. Right? Wrong. See, Vault-Tec had ulterior motives with these vaults. Vault-Tec built these vaults as a way to facilitate human experimentation, to test the remaining human population, as part of something called the Societal Preservation Program run by a Dr. Stanislas Braun. Braun placed people in charge of these vaults that were called overseers, and the majority of them were fully aware of the true nature and purpose of these vaults. Braun even threatened the overseers to secure their absolute secrecy in regard to what was going on in the vaults. But the reason for this experimentation was in order to support a much bigger vision. In the game, we encounter an antagonistic faction calling themselves the Enclave. They are paramilitary and they claim to be the remnants of the US government. The Enclave were a shadow military government which would seize control of the US in the event of nuclear destruction. Their motives were based around Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and you can probably see where this is going. The President of the US, a member of the Enclave, decided to abandon the White House and relocated to a fortified oil rig named Control Station Enclave, which was owned by Poseidon Energy. The Enclave would essentially oversee the human experimentation in the vaults from the oil rig, and that allowed them to control what was happening inside these vaults. The rig was also a control center from which the government could continue its war against China. Anyway, 200 years into the future, many in the post-nuclear wasteland see them as fascists. Powerful old men who didn't want to give up their power. In Fallout 3 at least, we see the Enclave being pursued by the Brotherhood of Steel, another paramilitary organization who were themselves more focused on preserving advanced tech and who would try and ensure proper regulations around its use. The Enclave had a larger plan involving something called the multi-generational starship, their own way of preserving humanity. Therefore, the Enclave created an interstellar ship which could take the world's best, fittest and brightest minds to a new planet which was fit for habitation and rebuild civilization from there instead. The Vault's experiments would essentially weed out the weakest and leave the best. But with a brief bit of background out the way, let's now look at the vaults of Fallout 3 and the experiments contained therein. So let's start with the Lone Wanderer's home vault. In my script I have home in quotations, as the vault wasn't actually the Lone Wanderer's home vault, but that's something I've covered in the Law and Order video. So Vault 101 wasn't really part of the horrific human experimentation as such. It was designed to support human survival indefinitely, as in the vault was never designed to be opened at all. But it did have an experiment attached, and that was to observe the role of the Overseer, and I guess to see how they would follow their instructions and their directive. The Vault's experiment was coordinated by the Overseer, who was a Vault-Tec plant, and the Overseer of Vault 101 created the illusion that there was literally nothing outside the vault other than an irradiated wasteland. They managed to achieve this level of control via falsified radio reports created by Vault-Tec, further feeding the narrative that all hope was lost of ever venturing out of the vault and onto the surface. The next Overseers became even more isolationist and dictatorial. Sometime before the game takes place, an Overseer was placed in charge who wanted to open up trade with people on the surface. So a survey team consisting of a then young Mrs. Palmer, the grandmother of Vault 101 resident Jonas, reported their findings. They killed a giant mutated ant and took it back to the vault for examination, and they came across the nearby town of Megaton. 2 Vault residents ended up staying in Megaton. The overseer in charge at that time went missing, so Alphonse Almodovar took over, and he is the overseer we see in charge at the time the game takes place. Alphonse reinforced the strict isolationism of previous overseers, but despite this, he allowed James and the Lone Wanderer, then a baby, to live in the vault, and James would become the vault's new physician. But the vault, due to it having been open various times, had developed a radroach infestation. And this is when everything kicked off, leading to James using that as cover to leave the vault, and the Lone Wanderer going after him. Radroaches started attacking the security team in the vault, resulting in the deaths of some of the vault dwellers. After the Lone Wanderer leaves the vault, Amata, one of the vault dwellers and Alphonse's daughter, sends out a message to the wasteland asking for the Lone Wanderer to return. Upon returning, the vault has been thrown into disarray. Amata, the overseer's daughter, has formed a band of rebels, all of them angry at her father for lying to them about the wasteland. They want to stay in the vault but open up the vault to traders. The overseer is refusing. Turns out that the Enclave had turned up and wanted entry into the vault, but Alphonse had refused, which of course was likely the last straw for the rebellion. The Lone Wanderer can force them out by sabotaging the vault's water purification chip, or they can have a friendly chat with the overseer and convince him to step down. Amata then becomes the overseer and bans the Lone Wanderer from the vault, rude, and then the Lone Wanderer leaves that vault, never to return again. So earlier I mentioned a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun. As well as being the director of the Societal Preservation Program, Braun was contacted by the US Army to develop a method for the preservation of human life, so he came up with something called the GEC, and this stood for the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, a terraforming module capable of creating life in a barren wasteland. Some vaults got one, some didn't. Anyway, onto Vault 112's experiment. Just before the war broke out in 2077, Braun escaped to Vault 112. The vault itself was very well hidden, being hidden deep underneath an old garage. Vault 112 was built to house 85 occupants, and it was to be a virtual world. Forever. The vault's overseer was Braun himself. He installed units called Visiontron Loungers, and these would contain virtual reality locations, or utopias. It was inside these utopias that Braun would exhibit his sadism. The first of these utopias was a place called Toucan Lagoon, a hot sunny place, a place of relaxation and tranquility. Braun adjusted the simulation for his own amusement. The other occupants of the vault would be killed in the simulation, much to the delight and amusement of Braun. But alas, Braun would grow bored, so he reset the simulation. This time the simulation would be set at Slalom Chalet. Again, there was much death. Braun was excited at the sight of fresh blood on the white snow, but after 23 years of that, Braun was bored again. So he created a suburbia that he called Tranquility Lane. Now this is where the Lone Wanderer enters into the simulation. Braun comments how despite it being American, the setting reminds him of his hometown. He mentions that the residents seem at home and safe. He then comments at how he loves toying with them and shattering their perfect lives. He disguises himself as a little girl called Betty. Braun, as Betty, asks the Lone Wanderer to mess with the lives of the residents purely for his own enjoyment. And these include things like making a little boy called Timmy cry, breaking up a happily married couple, and eventually killing someone. Braun has complete control over the simulation, and if the Lone Wanderer tries to attack Betty, the Lone Wanderer is instantly killed. Braun's control over the simulation was also such that no one could actually leave the simulation on their own. Braun, after killing his victims, would wipe their memories and restore them, only to torment them again and again and again. Everyone is under the illusion that the simulation isn't that at all. It's 100% real, with them calling the Lone Wanderer crazy when they mention it. Due to one of the pods in the vault malfunctioning, its occupant, Old Lady Dithers, is aware that it's a simulation, and her avatar asks the Lone Wanderer to do something about it. Braun had a failsafe installed in the simulation. In this case, the failsafe was a military simulation, not purposed for civilian use. Braun installed the failsafe as a way to put an end to the simulation. As a result, Braun's avatar would be left alone in the simulation for eternity. In it, Chinese communist forces invade Tranquility Lane and shoot everyone dead. This kills them all for real, considering they've been alive for over 200 years and are being toyed with by Braun. Killing them via this option seems like a mercy. It's unclear whether or not this vault was Braun's own personal project purely to satisfy his sadistic nature, but it seems that this may have been the case. On the other hand, it could be that Braun genuinely intended to provide a utopia, but got drunk on the power that he had over these people, and ended up abusing that power. Vault 87 was, at least in terms of record keeping, pretty secretive. The number of occupants was redacted, as was the duration of the experiment. It had 4 stasis chambers, 3 plasma containment fields, a GEC, along with 6 food processing stations. The nature of this Vault's experiments were pretty messed up, to say the least. It was home to the Evolutionary Experimentation Program, run by a Dr. Wayne Merrick and his research team. The subjects would be exposed to something called the FEV, the Forced Evolutionary Virus. In 2073, before the Great War and during the Resource Wars, the US were increasingly concerned at China's planned use of bioweapons on the front lines of Anchorage, and so the US set up research on a countermeasure or a potential cure called the Pan-Immunity Virion Project. It basically meant evolution through infection. Experiments were carried out by a defense contractor called Vault-Tec at their research facility in Southern California. In 2075, the Pan-Immunity Virion was renamed the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV for short. This virus could change the subject's DNA to whatever Vault-Tec or the government wished. Tests were initially carried out on small animals, with them showing an increase in size and aggression. But in 2077, the military moved Vault-Tec experimentation on FEV to the Mariposa military base in California and began their testing on human subjects, with Vault-Tec researchers in disagreement. Despite this, the tests were a success, and the US military were on the verge of creating super soldiers. But the strain of FEV used in Vault 87 was a different strain of the FEV virus known as the EEP strain, which of course refers to Evolutionary Experimentation Program. This is something that goes all the way back to the early Fallout games, but let's stay on track. According to terminal entries from one of the researchers, 93 Vault 87 residents have died, with only 4 of those deaths being from natural causes, and 87 being unexplained or undefined. On Dr. Merrick's terminal, he notes that subject exposure to the FEV is showing promise, and that their 5 subjects consist of 2 males and 3 females. He notes that they are facing pressure from Vault-Tec and the military at Mariposa, where the FEV was initially created. Later, Dr. Merrick noted that the subjects were exhibiting physical changes, with the females losing their visible female indicators and transforming to an asexual state, as well as muscle formation and upper body strength. The male subjects underwent transformations to this state too. However, subjects began to die. One subject, Mary, died as a result of massive loss of brain function. They continued to observe and discovered that their skin thickened and was more resilient. It's noted that the FEV was modified in order for the strain to do exactly that. But later, Dr. Merrick writes about how the subjects deteriorated, having become angry and anxious. So due to the danger posed to everyone inside the facility, Dr. Merrick had them all destroyed. And as you can imagine, these experiments didn't work out well for the rest of the Vault dwellers and the research staff, as they all ended up dead or worse. Essentially, ever since 2078, the super mutants in the Capital Wasteland have originated from this Vault. They haven't survived through natural reproduction, as they're asexual and sterile. So instead, they drag humans such as poor Sid back to Vault 87 and infect them with FEV, turning them into super mutants. And of course, these super mutants continue to mutate as they age, and they will eventually turn into super mutant behemoths. One particular super mutant named Forks, referring to himself as a metahuman instead, shows signs of intelligence. He said he was born out of the FEV chambers, hence his Vault jumpsuit. He remarks that he still remembers various glimpses of his past. However, he doesn't remember exactly who he was. He gained his intelligence by reading information on a terminal inside an observation chamber, which the super mutants duly destroyed. He learned about history, hence why he called himself Forks. Due to his intelligence and his tendency for non-violence towards humans, he is either despised by his fellow muties, or they are fascinated by him, and as a result the super mutants locked him up in an observation room inside Vault 87, until he is either killed or freed by the Lone Wanderer. Now we move on to Vault 92. Vault 92 was a way to preserve musical talent, so the country's best musicians were invited to live inside the vault.
When the war reared its head, she was invited by Vault-Tec into Vault 92. They claimed the vault would be dedicated to preserving musical talent. Vault-Tec was always promoting the vaults being used for the preservation of the arts and all that nonsense. Hilda couldn't pass on a chance to meet many of the other musical talents of the world, so she accepted their invitation. Then the bombs fell, the vault was sealed, and my family never heard from her again.
According to the vault records in the Citadel, 92 was designed to hold 245 people, and it was intended for a duration of 100 years. In order to facilitate and to keep the musicians musically sharp, they were provided with equipment, the finest instruments, and the equipment to be able to record. But like the other vaults, this vault was for something way darker. The vault overseer, a Richard Rubin, began exacting the experiment, the white noise mind suggestion combat experimentation. As the name suggests, Rubin would emit white noise with the aim of implanting combat instructions into the minds of human subjects, first through the isolated recording booths that the musicians were playing in. The overall aim was to see if they could create super soldiers who fight hard and who would be hard to put down, such was their ferocity in battle. Despite all the dark goings on in the background, one musician, Hilda, fell in love with the engineer for the recording studio, Parker. Overseer Rubin, along with the Professor Malleus, started to expand on the experiments and started to play the white noise through the main sound system in the studios, disguising it via music. People would notice, such as Parker, and he writes that he's hearing a strange, odd pitch overlaying the music.
I've been encouraged by the latest batch of data. It seems that 33% of the subjects are now lapsing into a trance-like state on occasion. When in this state, we're fairly certain that suggestion and programming of the subject can be applied. We've begun testing this by implanting subtle cues in affected subjects, making them scratch their ear or constantly fix their hair. So far, I'm happy to report a 100% success rate on this implementation method.
The experiments were going pretty well until Professor Malleus realised what was happening to the subjects. They were going insane and murdering other vault dwellers. Malleus soon learned that Rubin knew that this would turn the subjects violent, as the combat suggestions were directly from Vault-Tec, and he begged Rubin to stop the experiment. However, Malleus was physically assaulted by Rubin's security forces every time he tried and see him. But Rubin, as detailed in the Overseer's logs, was determined to push on. Malleus was taken off the project, and Rubin also drew the ire of the person in charge of the supply store, Gordy, as Rubin had banned the distribution of anything that could potentially drown out the white noise, such as headphones. We get a glimpse into the mental deterioration of the subject through Zoe Hammerstein's journals. First, she was ecstatic to be surrounded by so many accomplished musicians, but then she went to the vault doctor, reported her symptoms, with the doctor saying it's probably stress. Her writings then devolved into the ramblings of a crazy person. Rubin then advanced the experiment, now playing the white noise inside the dormitories of the residents in order to expose them while they were sleeping. But it wasn't just the white noise that was making the vault an inhospitable place. The location of the vault, being in close proximity to underground bodies of water, meant that pipes began corroding. Leaks began to spring, leading to the engineers having to work overtime to try and fix them. The insanity spread and the residents ended up killing each other. Malleus had had enough. He incited an uprising and went to confront Rubin, but it's not exactly known what happened to both of them. With the vault in a state of disrepair, the vault flooded, including the reactor room, and creatures such as Mirelurks would enter the vault and make it a nest. Hilda and Parker, it seems, died together, with Hilda leaving behind her perfectly preserved Swal Stradivarius violin. Hilda's ancestor, Agatha, lives in the capital wasteland, and the Lone Wanderer can deliver her great-grandmother's violin to her. In terms of Vault 106, this vault consisted of 95 subjects and 12 researchers, and the experiment inside was to take place for the duration of 12 years and 3 months. The overseer was a Dr. Albert Leris, who worked in Vault-Tec's psychological research department, and the information surrounding the results were redacted. 10 days after the vault was sealed, the experiment began. Psychoactive drugs were to be pumped into the vault. Judging from a memo from the vault's overseer, he tried to play it down as a fault with the air filtration system, which has since been fixed. Over the overseer's terminal, we see that the gas had only been referred to as the control, and that they are prepared for the worst. Then, at 3:30 in the afternoon, the gas was released, and the security forces were advised to go to pre-selected safe zones in order to be spared the effects of the gas. The overseer, however, explicitly states that the effects of the gas are non-lethal and that the gas will be cleared out by 4 o'clock. It's likely that the insane survivors inside the vault are raiders or wastelanders who ventured inside looking for loot and supplies, and due to the gas went insane just like the residents of the vault, thought they were members of the vault, hence why they are wearing vault jumpsuits. Tragically, it seems that some of the original vault dwellers tried to blow themselves away out of the vault to escape the insanity, but ended up dying in the process. And that's pretty much it for the story behind Vault 106, a pretty basic one. When the Lone Wanderer visits the vault, the gas is still being distributed into the vault, as the Lone Wanderer experiences hallucinations of their own time in Vault 101. And finally, onto our last vault. And this is probably the most bizarre one, the Gary Vault, or Vault 108. As mentioned earlier, Vault 108 suffered a work stoppage in its construction, but was eventually completed in December 2069. The number of occupants was to be 475, and the duration of the experiment was meant to be 38 years, with the main power supply for the vault designed to fail within 20. The vault had a secondary power supply named the Steam Whistle, but that power supply couldn't power the entire vault at once. Now, the overseer was a Brodie Jones. According to the Citadel's Vault records, Jones had a genetic disposition to a rare terminal strain of cancer, and he'd die in just over 3 years. Despite there being 475 spaces for residents, these were intentionally left empty, and the vault was overstocked with weaponry. As for the experiment, well, here goes. The Overseer dying was initially planned out for an experiment in order to see what would happen when, after the Overseer died, how the tussle for leadership would play out. Conflicts in leadership. It's my guess that after the Overseer died, Vault-Tec hoped that a civil war would break out in the vault, although we don't know if that happened. But now for the really bizarre part. The scientists inside the vault started cloning experiments, but it seems that this was nothing to do with the initial Vault-Tec experiment. The clones produced were all copies of a man named Gary, a resident of the vault from 2077 onwards until his death. By the time the Lone Wanderer gets to the vault, it appears that 54 Gary clones have been created, and a log, presumably written by a scientist, states that the later Garys were hostile towards anyone who wasn't a clone, with Garys becoming more and more hostile and aggressive with each version. This could be because they may have been cloning cloned Garys. 52 Garys were to be disposed of, but it seems that this never happened, as many of these previous Garys are still wandering around the vault, meaning a revolt happened and they killed the scientists who were trying to kill them. The Gary clones also only say one thing. Gary! Indicating that they don't know or speak English at all. Now, these clones may have been produced in an attempt to spark the civil war inside the vault, therefore kicking off the intended experiment, with the power struggle taking place and someone eventually taking leadership of the vault itself. Or it could be that one of the higher-ups wanted their own army that were loyal to them in order to seize power in the vault. Or maybe the scientists got bored. Who knows? Let me know what you think below. As a side note, one of the Gary clones is found at Virtual Strategic Systems building after he was captured by the Brotherhood Outcasts. They wanted his Pip-Boy in order to access a simulation of Operation Anchorage so that they could access an armory inside of the building. An armory that contained some pretty rare and impressive tech. But after they chopped Gary's arm off, they realised the subject needed to be alive and attached to the Pip-Boy in order for the simulation to work. But that pretty much brings this video to a close. I've enjoyed jumping back into Fallout 3 and can't wait to get into Fallout New Vegas next. Like I said, a Law & Order video for the story of Fallout 3 is available, so please check that out if you haven't already. But if you enjoyed this video, please show your support by leaving a like and subscribing if you aren't already. Leave a comment down below, but for now, take care and I will see you in the next one.